Cuba, a small Caribbean island 90 miles south of Miami, Florida, had a revolution in 1959. Fidel Castro's communist regime overturned Fulgencio Batista's government. By the end of 1961, at least 87,000 Cubans had fled to Miami. This wave of immigrants was so large, an emergency refugee center for Cubans was created in Miami in 1960. This group of immigrants in the U.S. were friendly, and they believed they were only staying in the U.S. as long as Fidel Castro's dictatorship lasted. In March 1960, the Cuban Refugee Program was created by President John F. Kennedy. The U.S. government justified providing financial and physical aid to the Cubans by framing the aid as an absolute need and describing them as hard-working people. While Cubans were receiving public aid as political refugees, other groups of refugees had no such luck. Over the 1960s and 70s, 60,000 Haitians and 500,000 Central Americans fled to Florida. These Haitian immigrants were considered economic refugees and were not given financial aid, sometimes sent back to Haiti. The Central American immigrants came from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Nicaragua, all countries ruled by dictators. However, these dictators were supported by the U.S. because they were not communists, so the Central American immigrants could not get refugee status unless they proved their lives were in danger because of their political beliefs. However, the U.S. accepted Cubans as political refugees because they were fleeing communism, and the U.S. was very anti-communist during the Cold War. By the 1970s, most Cuban refugees in Miami either thought of themselves as exiles or immigrants. Exile refugees wanted to overthrow Castro's regime and thought they were guests in the U.S. Immigrant refugees were involved in American life and politics, thinking they were in the U.S. to stay. From the 1960s to 2000, the number of exile-minded Cubans outnumbered the immigrant-minded Cubans. The Cuban exile community dominated politics in southern Florida. Exile Cubans agreed with the Republican Party because they were strong anti-communists, so they voted very differently from the other non-Cuban Hispanic groups in the region. This makes sense because the Cuban exile community was given the time to establish itself politically and economically in ways that other Hispanic groups had not. However, the younger immigrant-minded Cubans grew up and outnumbered the old exile-minded Cubans. These generations of Cubans didn't want to go to Cuba like the exile Cubans did because a lot of them were born and or raised in the U.S. Cuba wasn't their home. By this time, the Bill Clinton administration dealt with the Cuban Boxero crisis in 1994. The Cuban government did not stop Cubans from illegally leaving to the U.S. because they were frustrated that the U.S. had been accepting them as political refugees. So there were too many Cuban refugees coming to the U.S. at one time. President Clinton responded by creating the dry-foot, wet-foot policy, where Cubans who stepped on U.S. land could be refugees, but Cubans who were caught in the ocean leaving Cuba were sent back. One international display of this new policy was the Elián González crisis. In late 1999, a 5-year-old boy named Elián González was found in an inner tube floating off the coast of Florida. His mother and other Cubans had been illegally escaping the island when a motor failure and a night storm sank their raft and drowned them all except Elián and 2 other Cubans. Fishermen picked up the survivors and turned them over to the U.S. Coast Guard. Elián González had an uncle living in Miami, Lázaro González, who claimed custody of him while he stayed in the U.S. There was an international custody battle. The González family and the Cuban exile community in Miami fought for Elián to stay in the U.S., just like Cuban refugees did before the dry-foot, wet-foot policy. But the Cuban government and Elián's father, who was in Cuba, fought for his return to his native country. Eventually, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that Elián must be reunited with his father in Cuba, upholding the dry-foot, wet-foot policy. This shocked and angered the Cuban exile community in Miami, who refused to give up Elián. The ordeal ended in 2000 with the dawn raid of the González home by immigration officials to get custody of Elián. The U.S. government sent Elián back to his father in Cuba. It ended up upholding the dry-foot, wet-foot policy from the Clinton administration and showed that the Cuban exile community in southern Florida no longer had the political power to influence immigration policies like it once did. Cubans were no longer treated as special refugees.